In 1923, Georges Méliès, cinema's first magician, inventor of the first ever special effects, destroyed all his work in a fit of desperation. The original negatives of the 520 films he directed between 1896 and 1913 went up in flames. Were the dreams, the enchanting visions, the masterpieces really lost forever? Maybe not. 100 years later, Méliès the magician is to perform a final magic trick and will reappear eternally youthful. But this is another one of your tricks, isn't it, Monsieur Méliès?
C'est un personnage absolument extraordinaire, Méliès. C'est le cinéaste qui a fait tous les trucages possibles et imaginaires. Il a tout commencé. Tout ce qu'on fait depuis, puis voilà, il l'a déjà fait et puis on le recommence.
Il y a quelque chose de joyeux, de constamment inventif. Et je sais pas, il y a une créativité énorme, évidemment, mais il y a encore des éléments dans son travail qui sont totalement modernes maintenant.
Méliès est quand même profondément ancré dans le 19e siècle, et plus particulièrement dans la fin du 19e siècle, qui est quand même celui, effectivement, des grandes féeries théâtrales, des théâtres de magie. Il y a un véritable engouement pour ces deux genres à cette époque. Et lui, il participe pleinement de cet élan, parce que le genre Méliès est profondément imprégné de cette féerie qu'il avait vue dans son enfance au théâtre du Châtelet ou au théâtre de la Gaîté.
Nothing predestined Georges Méliès to become a master of fantasy and illusion. Born in Paris in 1861, he was the youngest of three sons of the wealthy Jean-Louis Stanislas Méliès, a luxury shoemaker. He enjoyed a privileged childhood and received a good education, but dreamed of studying fine arts. His father refused. Georges had to join the family business. At his father's factory, he was mainly in charge of machine maintenance, which meant he acquired excellent mechanical skills. In 1885, upon his return from military service, he married Eugénie Genet, the daughter of another shoe salesman. There's no escaping your destiny.
Ses parents l'envoient à Londres faire une sorte de stage chez un marchand de tissus, mais en fait, au lieu de travailler dur, il fréquente surtout les théâtres de magie, et surtout, à cette époque, Londres est un peu le centre des magiciens. Donc il y a l'Egyptian Hall notamment, où on monte des trucs absolument extraordinaires qui vont beaucoup l'inspirer par la suite. Donc en fait, Méliès revient à Paris, totalement obsédé par la magie, et plus du tout par la fabrication de chaussures, ça c'est certain.
Méliès quickly mastered the art of illusion and started performing on stage. He gave shows in Parisian salons, at the Cabinet Fantastique of the Grévin Museum, and at the Theatre of Magic in the Galerie Vivienne. In 1888, When his father retired and left the business to his sons, Georges used his share of the inheritance to buy the famous Robert Houdin Theatre in Paris, a shrine to modern magic on the Grand Boulevards.
Méliès va, en 1888, prendre possession de ce théâtre, de tout ce qu'il y a à l'intérieur aussi. Il y a tout le matériel de Robert Houdin, il y a tous les automates, c'est génial, et toute l'équipe. Il va se jeter dans cet art qu'il adore avec une énergie extraordinaire, avec un amour extraordinaire, mais c'est un peu comme une danseuse, c'est-à-dire qu'il va y perdre en fait énormément d'argent.
Méliès began by renovating the theatre. The place was well known but had fallen on hard times since the death of Robert Houdin in 1871. Méliès invented amazing illusions for his new shows and quickly gained a reputation. The more new stage shows he created, the greater his popularity. Méliès was soon a figurehead of his profession. At the end of the 19th century, Paris was sparkling. New attractions flourished all along the Grand Boulevards. At the Grévin Museum, right next to the Robert Houdin Theatre, Émile Reynaud presented his Pantomime Lumineuse, a precursor of animated films. It was also on the boulevards that Thomas Edison's kinetoscope was first presented in Paris, a peculiar apparatus allowing individual viewing of short scenes recorded on film. Among the spectators was the photographer Antoine Lumière, who was amazed by what he saw. He subsequently gave his two sons, Auguste and Louis, the assignment of building an apparatus that would allow the projection of animated photographs.
Mon premier contact réel a été établi entre moi et M. Lumière par suite de circonstances tout à fait fortuites. Je le rencontrais dans l'escalier du théâtre, dont j'étais le directeur à ce moment-là, au théâtre Robert Houdin. Et comme il me connaissait de vue, il me dit « Dites donc, M. Méliès, vous qui avez l'habitude dans vos trucs d'étonner quelque peu votre public, je serais bien heureux de vous faire venir ce soir au Grand Café. » Pourquoi, lui dis-je, mais parce que vous allez voir quelque chose qui peut-être vous êtes patron vous-même. Et au début, quand j'ai vu son appareil, n'est-ce pas, projeter des photographies immobiles en commençant, j'ai dit comment on me dérange pour voir des projections, il y a près de 20 ans que j'en fais, ça n'a rien d'extraordinaire. Quand tout à coup, je vis le personnage se mettre en mouvement, venir vers nous, quelques minutes après, un train s'est lancé et prêt à traverser la toile, se précipiter dans l'auditoire, nous étions tous, je dois le dire, absolument stupéfaits. Immédiatement, j'ai dit, voilà mon affaire, un truc extraordinaire.
It was on December 28, 1895, and Georges Méliès' destiny had changed forever. Having built his own camera, he began shooting his first film, A Card Party, reprising a theme previously used by the Lumière brothers. Seated on the left is Lucien Rolos, who was his associate for 1 year, the only associate he ever had. Together, they registered Méliès' trademark, the Star Films Star, and invented the kinetograph, a projection machine that was difficult to sell and quickly forgotten. However, their film catalog rapidly expanded, with new titles presented every night at the Robert Houdin Theatre, beginning in April 1896. Although his first films were similar to the Lumière's work, Méliès soon turned to more original subjects, inspired by performers who had made his theatre's reputation, such as the famous act of The Vanishing Lady. On stage, disappearance required special accessories to hide the moment when the base of the chair tilted. This allowed the young woman to disappear through a trapdoor hidden under a newspaper. On film, Méliès could use a far simpler trick. The idea came to him completely by chance.
C'est tout simplement un blocage d'appareil qui s'est produit place de l'Opéra pendant que je prenais les voitures qui passaient devant moi. Tout à coup, l'appareil s'arrête. Le temps qu'on le débloque, naturellement, les voitures qui suivaient avaient changé de place. Et j'ai eu la surprise, après collage, de voir tout d'un coup apparaître à la place d'un omnibus Madeleine Bastille un corbillard avec la famille qui suivait derrière.
The first cinema special effect was born. Méliès would use it and abuse it for years to come. Though the Lumiere brothers invented the cinematograph, Méliès created the cinematic spectacle. Louis Lumiere himself said so. In Georges' hands, the camera didn't attempt to record reality, but presented a world where fantasy and magic reigned supreme.
Comme tous les pionniers, en fait, en 1896, Méliès tourne en plein air, dans son jardin, devant une toile peinte, voilà. Et donc on voit bien qu'il y a des problèmes de lumière, et puis devant, il y a la toile qui bat, etc. Donc il a l'idée très vite, effectivement, de construire un studio de verre, imiter des studios de photographes. Et là aussi, il est quand même l'un des premiers à faire cette architecture incroyable pour abriter et tourner sereinement ces vues fantastiques.
Le premier studio était simplement une grande salle longue de 17 mètres sur 6 de large, vitrée de tous les côtés en verre dépoli, et sans aucune préparation. Il n'y avait à ce moment-là aucun truc de scène, n'est-ce pas, comme j'ai fait plus tard. Plus tard, j'ai monté toute une machinerie théâtrale avec dessous et dessus, de façon à pouvoir faire de la grande féerie quand je suis arrivé à faire des pièces importantes.
Contrairement au spectacle de magie où il pouvait déléguer en fait la mise en scène une fois qu'il avait fixé un cadre, au cinéma c'est lui qui invente, c'est lui qui a la maîtrise de ce qui se passe dans le studio, donc il faut impérativement qu'il soit là, devant, derrière la caméra et à la maîtrise de l'ensemble du processus de création.
En fait, c'est un homme suractif. Il n'arrête pas de toute la journée. Il se rend donc à Montreuil. Il dessine ses décors, parfois lui-même. En tout cas, il fait ses propres esquisses. Et il fait répéter ses acteurs. Il a dans la tête le scénario. En général, il n'est pas écrit. Il a déjà prévu les trucs. Il les a déjà imaginés. Il est acteur, comédien, réalisateur, truqueur, scénariste. En fait, c'est l'homme orchestre, hein, Méliès. Il fait tout à la fois. C'est un cas unique dans l'histoire du cinéma. soir. Ça s'arrête pas du tout là. Méliès revient à Paris, va au théâtre Robert Houdin, et puis la journée finalement se termine très tard. Et le lendemain, ça recommence. Tout le monde s'accorde à dire qu'il s'accordait très très peu de repos, mais pour lui, c'était pas du travail naturellement, c'était une joie constante, quoi.
In 1898, France faced a serious political and social crisis. The Dreyfus Affair divided public opinion. Unfairly convicted of spying for Germany, Captain Dreyfus, of Jewish descent, had been rotting in prison for 4 years. Eventually, the real culprit was acquitted. To defend Dreyfus was equal to attacking the army, the pride of the nation. Newsreels did not yet exist. In his studio, Méliès recreated the main events of the affair, which would continue to unfold for another 8 years. He himself took the role of Laborie, Dreyfus's attorney, thus publicly exhibiting whose side he was on. Ten years earlier, when he had been contemplating a career as an illustrator, he'd already, in his drawings, fought General Boulanger's threats against the recent fragile French democracy. With The Dreyfus Affair, the first ever political film, Méliès revealed new possibilities for the brand new cinema industry. The Star Film Company had now taken on all genres: advertisements, dramas, comedies, even historical reenactments. But the verdict of audiences was clear. They preferred extravaganzas, trick films filled with lavish and ingenious visual effects. In a word, the Méliès genre.
Ils sont joyeux, tous ces films. Et on peut même analyser le public de cette époque, voir avec quoi ils s'amusaient, les gens, en voyant les films de Méliès. C'est-à-dire, psychologiquement et socialement, on peut très bien faire une explication du public par rapport aux gags, par rapport aux histoires qu'ils aimaient, parce qu'ils aimaient ces histoires, et c'était un succès énorme, Méliès.
Si on veut comprendre Méliès, il faut comprendre que Méliès s'adresse d'abord à deux clientèles. D'abord la sienne, c'était le petit théâtre Robert Houdin, mais l'essentiel de la production est réservé aux forains. Les gens à cette époque voyaient des films à l'intérieur de tentes avec des conditions de projection qui étaient très particulières. Il y avait l'aboyeur derrière qui ameutait la foule, il y avait un bonimenteur avec de la musique, avec le son des groupes électrogènes. Il y avait un univers sonore, voire olfactif, tout à fait extraordinaire. Donc, si vous voulez, on n'arrive plus à l'heure actuelle à retrouver. C'est un secret perdu, en fait. Le succès des films de Méliès s'explique aussi grâce à cela. C'est-à-dire que c'est les forains qui ont su trouver la bonne combinaison pour rendre ces films absolument extraordinairement attractifs.
In 1902, Méliès presented his masterpiece, A Trip to the Moon, a truly spectacular film in 30 scenes, which required 3 months' work. This was unprecedented.
Ah bah, la Lune, c'était le rêve romantique de tout le monde. Et c'est une idée absolument extraordinaire. Évidemment, ça devient le best-seller le plus énorme du cinéma à l'époque.
Il y a une créativité énorme, évidemment, mais il y a aussi une logique complètement implacable là-dedans. il a des contraintes techniques parce qu'il tourne dans un espace restreint. Donc il crée sa profondeur avec la perspective, avec les arrière-plans. Et puis le reste, c'est l'imagination qui complète pour que le tableau, enfin le réalisme soit atteint.
Ce qui le distingue, au fond, c'est pas sa science des trucages, c'est pas sa technique, c'est son imagination, qui a l'air sans fin et qui a l'air constamment en éveil et constamment en œuvre. C'est ça qui est formidable chez lui.
The success of A Trip to the Moon was bound to attract competitors, especially Charles Pathé, who immediately made his own version of it. Often copied but never equaled, Méliès' films combine magic and cinema in an extremely clever combination of theatrical machinery, optical and pyrotechnical effects, crossfades, and superimpositions. All of this was gleefully devised by Méliès to render the imaginary and the impossible clearly visible on film. For several years, Star Film was successful and renowned worldwide. Everyone wanted more Méliès films. At the time, elaborate new special effects scenes would emerge from the Montreuil studio every month. New fairy tales and fanciful journeys, ever more spectacular. Running at full capacity, the studio became cramped. So Méliès built a second studio in 1907 on his vast property, leaning against his father's old house. From then on, he was able to shoot 2 films at the same time in an attempt to meet the demands of an ever-changing market.
À cette époque, il était reconnu comme une personnalité très influente, il était ami avec toute la corporation, mais tout le monde le considérait comme un original, comme un artisan, comme un artiste. Et donc il était assez isolé en fait.
In February 1909, the Film Publishers Congress met in Paris, with Georges Méliès as chairman. He was surrounded by Léon Gaumont, George Eastman, Charles Pathé, and all the major international producers, ready to dictate the new rules of the game, because cinema had become an industry, a serious business. In big cities, more and more theaters were being built solely dedicated to showing film. These permanent structures generated an entirely different economic model for film distribution. Prints were no longer sold on fairgrounds to traveling exhibitors, as before, but rented out in order to renew programs more quickly and increase revenue. This change required an organization and investment that Méliès could not provide. He had never set up a company and had always financed everything himself. But his one-time fortune was now only a distant memory. Moreover, the new system forced him to produce more product, just as special effects in fairy tales were going out of fashion. He delegated the direction of some films to his assistant, Manuel, but the results were unsatisfactory.
Méliès, il est dépassé. Il fait des blagues, il fait du théâtre, il fait des choses amusantes. Mais le cinéma rentre dans une époque, une période sérieuse. On touche à la société. Malgré son Dreyfus, il n'arrive pas quand même à faire des choses que d'autres, les Américains surtout en font, ailleurs, font des choses très très importantes. Et ça lui échappe un peu. Il n'arrive pas à sortir du théâtre et d'autres l'ont fait.
From then on, the Pathé Empire dominated world cinema. Charles Pathé is seen here with Ferdinand Zecca, the company's staff director, who stole ideas from Méliès for years. Paradoxically, in 1911, even though Méliès hadn't shot anything for a whole year, his long-standing rival offered to finance some new star films. One Last Chance, which may have been a pact with the devil. Unfortunately, the last 6 films were all failures. In 1913, Méliès was ruined, and the Star Film Studios closed down. He still had to earn a living, so during the war, the Montreuil studio was turned into a theater. The whole family was put to work, Méliès naturally reserving for himself the tasks of directing and stage design. Meanwhile, in Paris, the Robert Houdin Theatre was serving as a cinema, where soldiers on leave could discover Chaplin, the new king of the big screen. Cinema had entered a new era. In January 1922, Méliès was evicted from the Robert Houdin Theatre, which was to be demolished to allow for the expansion of the Haussmann Boulevard. The following year, he was forced to sell his Montreuil property to pay his debts. Méliès later said, "I didn't have anywhere to keep the hundreds of film negatives. In a moment of anger and exasperation, I ordered for them to be destroyed, without realizing that I was doing something as imprudent as it was irreversible."
Moi, j'ai pensé d'une sorte de suicide, hein. Une façon de se suicider à travers son œuvre, et une façon de protester aussi, énormément. Et il y a des artistes qui ont fait, des grands artistes qui ont brûlé des œuvres, qui ont brûlé des tableaux, qui ont brûlé, etc. Mais ça, c'est assez inexplicable.
A few years later, Georges Méliès could be found running a toy stand at the Montparnasse train station with Jeanne Dalcy. She was a former star of the Robert Houdin Theatre, where thanks to her tiny size and agility, she had performed wonders in disappearing acts. She had been the star of Méliès' first films, the first movie Vamp, and also his mistress. She was now his second wife.
Cet homme hyperactif se retrouve coincé dans une petite gargote, dans un couloir venteux de l'ancienne gare Montparnasse, quand même de 1925 à 1932. 7 ans de captivité, en quelque sorte, dans ce petit réduit où tout le monde l'oublie. Plus personne ne pense à lui. Malgré tout, il continue ses activités, notamment auprès de la Chambre syndicale de la presse et illustration, mais le milieu du cinéma l'a totalement oublié.
Méliès worked 7 days a week, 15 hours a day. In his rare moments of free time, he made drawings of some of the great scenes from his past masterpieces. Even if they could no longer be shown on screen, he never forgot them. Gradually, a new generation of cinephiles began to visit him and were deeply moved by his fate. In December 1929, Jean Mauclair, manager of Studio 28, organized a gala in his honor at the Salle Pleyel. For this tribute, they could find just 8 random films, often incomplete, deformed, or scratched. It must have been heartbreaking for the man who had invested everything in the fabulous beauty of images. In 1932, Méliès was taken in at the Château d'Orly, the film industry's retirement home, where he would finally be able to relax with Jean Dalcy and Madeleine, the granddaughter he had been looking after since 1930. He received numerous visits from young film enthusiasts who would later create the Cinémathèque Française, as well as old friends, movie people. They discussed a comeback, but in the end, his final screen appearance was in a simple cigarette advertisement. One last film, one last trick, and Méliès died on a gloomy day of January 1938. His studio, in ruins, was left to the weeds and street children and would eventually be destroyed in 1945. Only when it came time for tributes did the true quest for the lost works and invisible films of the magician from Montreuil begin. In 1948, the French Cinémathèque and its director Henri Langlois presented the first exhibition entirely dedicated to him.
La Cinémathèque française a toujours donné le ton, n'est-ce pas, le la, et a été toujours imité par les autres cinémathèques. Parce que Langlois, il y avait ce sens extraordinaire de dire on préserve les films, ce que faisait en Angleterre aussi, mais on les montre en même temps. Les films sont faits pour être montrés, donc on les montre. Langlois à la Cinémathèque avait déjà beaucoup travaillé sur Méliès, avait déjà sauvé beaucoup de choses, il avait réuni beaucoup de choses à la Cinémathèque.
En 1943, Langlois embauche la petite fille de Georges, Madeleine, qui devient secrétaire à la Cinémathèque française. Et donc, à partir de ce moment-là, effectivement, Madeleine va développer une vraie passion pour l'œuvre de son grand-père. Et elle va à son tour essayer de reconstituer ce puzzle très dispersé. Et elle va le faire avec beaucoup de passion et de volontarisme. Si bien qu'à un moment donné, ces deux personnalités très fortes vont se quereller, mais c'est de la faute aussi de Langlois, puisque Langlois lui avait dit moi je porte le cinéma du monde entier sur mes épaules, vous n'avez qu'à vous occuper de Méliès.
Au fil des ans, bien évidemment, différentes structures vont s'attacher à ce travail et c'est petit à petit que sur à peu près 40 ou 50 ans que des copies qui étaient gardées chez des collectionneurs vont réapparaître et c'est comme ça qu'on peut arriver à trouver des éléments de films de Georges Méliès.
In 1961, at the time of Méliès' centenary, about 60 of his films had been found. The search continued. Thanks to discoveries in basements and attics, old release prints were regularly located around the world. By the early 2000s, around 200 of the 520 films he shot had been located and were visible again. But most of the prints were mediocre or damaged, very often incomplete. This was also a race against time because old prints were made on chemically unstable film stock, which inevitably decomposes. The film becomes sticky, images disappear, and the film roll ends up as dust. While every new discovery added a piece to the puzzle, some could turn out to be of particular importance. In 2016, while trying to fill in the missing parts of The Wandering Jew, the Parisian preservationists at the company Lobster Films learned that it had survived in the USA at the Library of Congress. In a spectacular turn of events, what had survived was not a simple release print, but the original camera negative with exceptional image quality.
As part of the preservation process, the best source is always the original camera negative. Now, this is the reel of film that was in the camera, on the set, capturing those images. It is incredibly sharp. It has all the detail.
By comparing the negative with the print found in France, it could easily be determined that it was the same movie, even with the obvious difference in quality. But in comparing the two, another slight difference appeared. A little shift in the camera angle, giving a strange effect of parallax and depth. Could Méliès have been the first filmmaker to shoot a film in 3D as early as 1903? Who knows? There were more surprises in store. Upon investigation, instead of just one, there were 80 original negatives sitting on the shelves at the Library of Congress. How was this possible, since Méliès had burned them all in his garden? This was a mystery that simply had to be solved. The investigation would yield one surprise after another, eventually leading to a large rescue operation to restore a previously unknown part of Georges Méliès' work. To understand how those events unraveled, let us rewind a little. In August 1902, Méliès finished the production of A Trip to the Moon, on which he had spent 10,000 francs, a huge amount of money at that time. He naturally hoped to recoup his investment by selling prints of the film around the world. But In the United States, some prints were not purchased to be screened at all. Dishonest buyers sent them to laboratories to be copied. This meant there were countless counterfeits of inferior quality flooding the market. Here was the first act of piracy in the history of cinema. Despite the fact that Méliès had embedded the Star Film logo in the picture, this proved to be no problem for pirates, who simply scratched it off before the prints were copied.
In the early days of cinema, before World War I, the French were incredibly competitive with American film producers. So a lot of the film being seen in the United States was from France. The American film industry was a pretty ruthless business. There was a lot of competition. There was a lot of producers who were pretty unscrupulous about the way they went about making their films or even acquiring films. There was no such thing as copyright protecting motion pictures until around 1911, so kind of anything went.
To counter the fraudulent competition, Méliès decided to open a branch of Star Film in the United States and entrusted his brother Gaston with the task. 9 years his senior, Gaston had been in charge of the family's shoe business, but it had closed in 1896 due to mismanagement. He therefore had time on his hands and was ready for adventure. In March 1903, Gaston arrived in New York and moved into premises at 204 East 38th Street. 3 months later, the American branch was opened and ready to sell the Parisian productions of Star Films and protect them from counterfeiters. As customs fees for importing films from France were high, Gaston was also responsible for printing copies of Georges' films directly on site. But in order for them to maintain top quality, he needed a second original negative. For this, in Paris, Georges had created a curious device allowing him to obtain two identical negatives simultaneously when shooting a film. Identical or nearly identical. The lenses of both cameras were a few centimeters apart, which explains the slight difference in angle in the two prints. Two continents, two negatives, two Méliès. Here is the key to that mystery.
Méliès, effectivement, a été le premier à avoir l'idée de filmer avec deux caméras pour obtenir deux négatifs. En tout cas, cette idée allait être reprise en France et aux États-Unis, un peu partout. Et donc, c'est magnifique de considérer que les appareils qu'il a utilisés, notamment à partir de 1902, pour réaliser des films quand même assez sophistiqués, c'était quand même des appareils assez archaïques. Et malgré ça, il va obtenir quand même des miracles de précision dans le domaine des trucages.
For a short while at the American branch, business thrived. Georges, who had financed everything, received a return on his investment in less than a year. As for Gaston, he earned an important share of the profits. But the American market was not France, and the tide had started to turn.
Donc à une certaine époque, aux États-Unis, ce qu'on appelle la guerre des brevets, c'est-à-dire c'est Thomas Edison qui a déposé très tôt, en 1891, des brevets pour le kinétoscope, mais surtout pour le film 35 mm perforé. Et donc il peut revendiquer un certain nombre de choses sur tous ces gens qui produisent du film, en fait, puisqu'il s'en réclame l'inventeur. Donc il veut créer un trust en 1908 qui va appeler la MPPC, la Motion Picture Patent Corporation, qui va rassembler un certain nombre d'éditeurs. Et à un moment donné, Gaston Méliès, aux États-Unis, sent qu'il faut absolument y pénétrer, y entrer, pour que les intérêts de Georges soient représentés sur le sol américain.
Gaston Méliès thought that by joining in on Edison's patents companies that he would be licensed and it would enable him to distribute George's films coming in from Paris and being imported. Unfortunately, Edison realized that those films were very popular and profitable, and so he basically said to Gaston, I'm sorry, you can make your own films, but you can't distribute these films because they violate U.S. patent. It meant the George Méliès negatives were no longer of value because he couldn't do anything with them. So suddenly, these really wonderful films were basically old news and basically considered scrap.
Since he could no longer distribute Georges' films, Gaston started to produce his own in the U.S. and proceeded to set up the G. Méliès Manufacturing Company. Georges, Gaston, one G. Méliès replaced another, but the style was quite different. Gaston's films included westerns, dramas, comedies, in a word, modern stories. Gaston could see that magic and trick films were finished. While Georges was happy to receive royalties from Gaston's films, he didn't appreciate them. He especially didn't like that his American production company carried his name and worried that mixing genres would tarnish his own reputation. This confusion probably fooled many people. 30 years later, Orson Welles, a great admirer of Méliès, would pay a small tribute to him.
I'm going away tomorrow night. Indefinitely.
I hope you have ever so nice a time, George.
I don't expect to have a...
Unfortunately, the Méliès film poster he chose was for a film made by Gaston. In January 1911, Gaston left for California, which was fast becoming the El Dorado of cinema. But gradually, his actors and technicians left him to go to work for other, more established and prestigious companies. Business was bad. So Gaston left the United States for a 10-month trip to the Far East. Before his departure, he made sure to sell 50% of the G. Méliès company to the Vitagraph Company in Brooklyn, which continued to distribute his films. Meanwhile, as Georges' negatives no longer interested anyone and were very costly to store, Gaston gave them to a friend who would keep them in his basement. His travels led him to Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, Singapore, Cambodia, and finally to Japan. Gaston shot about 60 films there that were not at all successful. 1913. The Méliès brothers had cranked their last camera. They were now in complete disagreement and would never see each other again. The curtain closed on the American negatives of Georges and Gaston. Soon, the war would wipe out French youth, and with them, the memory of the Méliès name. Yet the odyssey of the American negatives of star film had only just begun. In the 1930s, Méliès was once again celebrated at his Orly retirement home. Louis Lumière finally presented him with the Legion of Honor. Compliments flowed. People suggested he present his films to bring in some money, as he was now penniless. But they were no longer in his possession, since he had destroyed them all. Then Méliès remembered the American negatives. But how could he get hold of them? Gaston had died in 1915, and the New York branch was long closed. Méliès was not the only person looking for his films. In the United States, Jean Leroy, another film pioneer, was trying to build a collection dedicated to early cinema. Jean Leroy, what a strange character. He contacted Méliès and told him an incredible story. A few years ago, he wrote, I had the star film negatives in my basement. He was the friend to whom Gaston had entrusted the precious treasure back in 1911. Unfortunately, he no longer had those negatives. In 1921, Gaston's son, Paul, had taken them back and sold them all. Méliès was flabbergasted. To him, one thing was certain. He was the sole owner of his movies. This was nothing short of robbery. He wanted this to become public knowledge, so he requested that Leroy publish ads in the press to prevent any exploitation of his films. The mysterious buyer was finally revealed and wasn't a thief at all, but Leon Schlesinger. Yes, indeed, Méliès' negatives were in the hand of the future producer of Bugs Bunny. He had 150 negatives, legally purchased, and also had a contract to prove it. Unfortunately, Schlesinger had failed to put these antiquities back into circulation. With the advent of talkies, he had moved on to other things. At that time, he was in fact trying to sell them to Paramount. Schlesinger nevertheless agreed to make a deal with Méliès, whom he admired, offering him a share of the profits and the possibility of making copies for himself. Unfortunately, in the end, the advertisements about the film theft years ago were harmful to all sides. The sale did not go through, and that's where things were left. Méliès never got his films back, but had the satisfaction of knowing that, tired of resisting, Schlesinger had deposited them with the museum. He later wrote, "A happy coincidence, much overdue, meant that the extraordinary productions of Georges Méliès would not be lost forever." The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences finally inherited the negatives in 1950, after the death of the Looney Tunes producer. But at that time, there were only 53 cans left, containing 80 films.
If we were to receive 53 cans of original Méliès negatives today, it would be a miracle. But at the time, in the 1950s, I don't know whether or not it was known what this was, the importance of these films.
At the time, the Academy didn't house its own archive. Some films were saved in 1958, but the machines then available were not designed for fragile, shrunken old prints, and the originals that were in good condition often ended up in pieces. The others continued to decompose. 20 years later, at the initiative of film archivist David Shepard, who wished to show the films, the negatives were transferred to the Library of Congress, which undertook a new restoration campaign. But most still didn't fit correctly in the machines. With every attempt to make a copy, the negative was further damaged. There were also unidentified and abandoned films. Clearly, a new rescue operation was essential. For that to happen, after a century on American soil, the precious 35mm negatives were returned to France.
It's really great that in this particular case, we've had the Academy and the Library of Congress, the CNC, and Lobster Films, to come together and to have these films end up being restored in a way that we can celebrate them once again and basically share them with the world. It's really fantastic.
This is the last opportunity to properly preserve these films for future generations, because these films may not survive in 5-10 years from now.
Pour la première fois, on voit ce qu'était la qualité des négatifs de Georges Méliès, et c'est vrai que c'est vraiment pour un restaurateur formidable d'avoir la possibilité de repartir de la matière première en quelque sorte. C'était des négatifs d'une excellente qualité, qui sont très bien développés, qui ont été très bien séchés. Ça, je pense que c'est aussi quelque chose d'important, la qualité du matériel d'origine. On a la chance d'avoir donc un matériau originel vraiment exceptionnel, et en face les outils qui permettent de restituer ce caractère exceptionnel.
The first step of the restoration is to make the films more flexible, or to unstick the frames when they have started to decompose. This requires a specific chemical treatment, which is banned in the United States for environmental reasons. Next, the films are digitized, frame by frame, using a high-quality scanner, which reveals their raw beauty. Numerous defects, the rips and ravages of time, still remain. Some are really terrible. That's when talented preservationists step in and use image editing programs that didn't exist until recent times. The project is only just beginning and will take many years to complete. But it is the end of a long journey these miraculous negatives have taken. It is also the promise of a new beginning, of making these treasured images available for eternity. For film lovers, it is nothing short of a triumph.
Film history teaches us where we've gone before and where we can go even further with our dreams, because it's the dream machine, right?